Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 8 on Warfare Through Time. And we're leaving the medieval period behind, ladies and gentlemen, and we're moving to the early modern period, 1500 to 1700, 200 years. Now, what changed during this particular period of English history, and what stayed the same as regards warfare? Well, hopefully the next few videos will try to explain that for you. Now, let's have a think. Right at the very end of the medieval period, the Battle of Bosworth, 1485, there it is. Battle of Bosworth, it ended the War of the Roses between the Yorkist House and the Lancastrians, 1485. And there you see a soldier on horseback, cavalry, and notice, he has a sword in his hand. Typical weapon for the medieval part of English history. Battle of Bosworth. What else do you know about the Battle of Bosworth? Probably not very much, so here's a couple of points for you. The armies on that day, roughly 5, 10, 12,000. Still quite a small army. How had they been recruited? Well, some had been recruited by using the old-fashioned assize of arms, and some had been recruited by payment, mercenaries, typical of the later medieval period. What sort of weapons did they use? Well, you've seen the sword, also used that day, bow and arrow, the longbow, axes. There was some change because there were some cannons used. But basically, ladies and gentlemen, the Battle of Bosworth was an old-fashioned medieval battle. What I'm going to try and show you now is that things begin to change. Now, this video, I'm just concentrating on the changes in weapons used as we moved into the early modern period of English history. And there are 4 key changes that I'm going to try and explain in this video. The first one, and probably the most important, I'll put it in a little poem for you. My poems are terrible, but here we go. The age of the longbow was done, replaced by musket, pistol and gun. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the longbow, it had been a fantastic weapon, very, very important, right the way back to the Battle of Falkirk, all the way through the medieval period. Think about how effective it was at the Battle of Agincourt. And yet, in the early modern period, the longbow goes into decline. It is replaced by guns. First of all, the musket, and then later the pistol. That's the first change. Second change, again, cavalry, using the pistol, ladies and gentlemen. Instead of using a sword or an axe, the cavalry mounted soldiers using a pistol. The second change. Third change, the introduction, the development of bayonets, a short sword or a dagger somehow attached to these new guns, the musket. That's the third change. And the fourth change, more use of cannons, or to give it its posh word, artillery. So they're the 4 changes that we'll look at throughout this video. Now, you've got to remember, it was a gradual change. It wasn't a change overnight. It was 1595, almost 100 years into the early modern period, before the government finally ordered no more archers to be trained. So it was a slow, gradual change, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Why did the longbow disappear? And why was it replaced by guns? Any ideas? Well, factors. Science and technology are improving. Somebody came up with the idea that instead of firing a sharpened piece of wood, an arrow, somehow they invented a mechanism which fired a piece of metal from a long barrel. So somebody came up with the technology to create, invent and develop the musket. That's one reason. Again, to do with technology. Some person, we've seen it before with the helmets. The helmet's protection was getting much better. Somebody came up with body armor, not just for the knights, but this time for the infantry, for the pikemen. They had very good body armor. And that meant, ladies and gentlemen, that particularly, for example, the Swiss army had very well protected and well armored pikemen. Their pikemen were virtually unbeatable. The arrows from the longbow could not pierce this new armor. The new armor was better. Think back to the Battle of Falkirk. William Wallace was doing very well with his schiltrons. King Edward said, let's fire our arrows. The longbow destroyed the schiltrons because their pikemen didn't have protection. But now there is protection, so therefore the longbow will not be as effective as a weapon. So they needed a different type of weapon. And step forward, change number one, the musket. Now the first type of musket was called a matchlock musket into the 1500s. Here's something though. How many arrows a minute could a really well-trained longbowman fire? Can you remember? Well, anywhere from 10 to 12 per minute. At first, the matchlock musket would fire once every 2 minutes. Nowhere near as good, nowhere near as effective. For rate of fire, it was much slower. Therefore, ask yourself the question, why did they still try out the musket, and why did they move away from the longbow? Well, here's some possible reasons to explain that decision. First of all, a musket shot was 20 times more powerful in energy than an arrow from a longbow. It could penetrate this new, very impressive armor. By 1550, they developed a 60-gram lead bullet, which was very, very effective. So that's the first reason. The second reason, a musket shot. If you were hit by the ball from the musket shot, even if it didn't kill you, it gave you a terrible wound. It was very debilitating. It caused far more damage than an arrow wound, giving the advantage to the attacker. Also, it lowered the morale of the people under fire. They didn't like the noise and they saw the damage it was doing. So people are moving towards the musket. The third reason, gradually they create a standard sized bore, it was called, like the diameter of the bullet. Now, that meant it could easily be mass produced, which meant it was cheaper, easier to store than arrows. To actually make high quality arrows was a very expertise, high intensive job. You needed to be highly skilled to make very good arrows. But the bullets for these muskets, like the ball, could be mass produced. Therefore, it was cheaper. The final point. To train to become a longbow expert took weeks, months, years, hour after hour after hour training to master the longbow. A couple of weeks meant that you had mastered the musket. It was far easier to train. Therefore, it made the matchlock musket far more attractive. Also, changes in society at that time, ladies and gentlemen. Changes in farming meant that there was less land in the countryside available for practice archery. Towns were growing, so people were moving from the countryside into the towns, so there's fewer men out in the countryside to practice where it was easier. Also, inflation was going up, prices were rising, therefore men needed to work longer hours to get a wage to live. So if they're working longer, they haven't got the time to practice their archery. So they all play a part as well. The start of the development of the matchlock musket. But, ladies and gentlemen, it had its limitations. It was the first example of it. What were the weaknesses? Well, it needed a match and then a smouldering cord. It didn't always work in damp or wet weather. At night you could see the match and that could give away your position to an enemy. The early matchlock muskets often failed to fire. The reload time I've already talked about was quite slow. The range was only 100 metres. A top archer, a longbow, could hit from 200, maybe 300. And at first the matchlock musket was not particularly accurate. Therefore, developments, improvements were necessary. So we moved to the second gun, ladies and gentlemen. Also with the matchlock, of course, if you've got lighted matches near a store of gunpowder, that's potentially dangerous. Boom! When you didn't want it. The second gun. Move away from the matchlock musket to something called the flintlock musket. Stone getting the spark instead of the match. After 1610, the flintlock musket. It was quicker, so there's an advantage. It was less dangerous because you don't need the matches. It was a bit more reliable. There's no need for the burning match. It was about probably twice as quick as the early matchlock muskets. Still not as good as the longbow, but it's getting quicker. So the flintlock had some advantages. Because it was better, it cost more. It was more expensive. But the army gradually realised that was better than the earlier musket. And again, by 1690, they've improved the flintlock musket and the army fully adopted the flintlock musket. So we've seen the musket has replaced the longbow, the first key change in early modern English warfare. Now, what about the second one? Pistols. Pistols, a much shorter weapon. 30 centimetres or maybe 60 centimetres. Imagine two rulers. Okay, so it's a shorter weapon. It could be fired one-handed because they're, again, technology. They've developed a wheel lock clockwork mechanism, which meant it could be fired one-handed. Therefore, it could be used by the cavalry. They could hold the reins of the horse in one hand and the pistol in the other hand. So that's an advantage. That is a change. On the other side, it was less powerful than the musket. It had a shorter range than the musket, so the cavalry would have to move towards the enemy to get closer so that they could fire their pistols. Again, not always totally reliable, and again the early pistols were quite expensive. By 1600, the flintlock pistol, using the same technology as the flintlock musket, the flintlock pistols introduced, and that was a bit more reliable. So the pistol was the second key change as regards weapons. The third, the bayonet. Now, the bayonet, a short sword or a dagger, somehow fixed or attached to the end of the musket. Why did they do it? Well, if you're firing from your musket and then the enemy gets near you, well, you can't reload. So therefore they thought, right, you're wasted as a soldier. If we put a little dagger on the end of your musket, you can use that as a weapon. So they are giving the soldier two types of ways of fighting, firing the musket and then stabbing with the bayonet. So that's why they did it, to stop waste. 1647, the first type of bayonet, a plug bayonet. And as it suggests, it's sort of plugged into the long opening in the barrel of the musket. But if it's plugged into the musket, then you cannot fire the musket at the same time. So therefore, that was a disadvantage. Also, it took quite a while to sort of plug it in. That's putting you at a disadvantage if the enemy is racing towards you. So the early bayonet, the plug bayonet, 1647, had some disadvantages. They try to improve it. Technology. They call it the ring bayonet. This time, the bayonet is attached to the outside of the musket barrel by 2 rings. Now that's better because you could still fire your musket and you've got the bayonet on. So that was better, but sometimes it worked loose and sometimes it would fall off. So it still wasn't perfect. More technology needed. Finally, the third and the final bayonet worked best of all. 1690s, the socket bayonet. Socket to them. The socket bayonet, again, it's attached to the outside of the musket, but it was locked in securely, so it wouldn't work loose and it wouldn't fall off. So the bayonet, the third change. And the bayonet remained a weapon well into the 20th century. It was used extensively in World War I, ladies and gentlemen. So that's the third change. The fourth and the final change as regards weapons. Cannons, artillery. We've seen that they were beginning to be introduced towards the end of the medieval period, particularly for sieges, if you are besieging a castle or a fortified town. What about in early modern? Again, technology plays a part. The cast iron industry meant that you could produce cannons on a larger scale. So that's important. Also, developments were made to the cannons, making it easier to alter the range and easier to alter and increase the rate of fire. So cannon fire did begin to improve. Lighter cannon meant that horses could pull it around the battlefield, not just using it for siege, but bringing it to the battlefield. Remember I said some cannon were used at the Battle of Bosworth, 1485. So cannons begin to be introduced as they begin to get better using technology. But just as the cannons were getting better, so were the defences. The castles or the fortified towns, the walls were getting stronger. They put earth in between the 2 different walls, which meant that it absorbed the impact of the cannonball and didn't shatter and cause as much damage. They also began to angle the walls so that the cannonballs would bounce off, like a ricochet. Okay? Also, they invented a system whereby the defence could fire their cannons at the attackers from what were called bastions, protected areas. So the cannons still remained a limited weapon in the early modern period. Yes, they've improved, but they still weren't the key weapon. They had a limited range. Accuracy was still a little bit dodgy. So we've seen change is beginning to happen. I've talked about 4 key changes there. There was a little bit of continuity though. Some things still did stay the same. The cavalry, yes, they had these new pistols, but they also kept their swords. Pikemen, keeping these long spears, 3, 4, 5 meters long. Yes, they've got now protected body armour, but they've still got the old weapon, the pike. So there's another example of continuity. In 1640s, in the English Civil War, we'll have a look at the Battle of Naseby in a few videos' time. But sometimes a third of the army, a third of the infantry still had the pikes. So there's some examples of continuity, things staying the same. But early modern did see the change, and probably the key change was the end of the longbow and the rise of the musket. Well, here's a GCSE question for us, ladies and gentlemen. Put my hat on. There we go. Here's one. What would you make of this? Explain why English armies stopped using the longbow from 1485 to 1600. Why did they stop using the longbow? They'll give you a couple of clues as usual, and here they are. Developments in armour, changes in society. Well, what would you write about? Why did they stop using the longbow? not as effective against the new armour. It couldn't penetrate the new armour. Therefore, they needed a new weapon, the musket. So you could talk about the advantages of the musket, matchlock musket, flintlock musket. You could talk about the pistol, giving extra weaponry to the cavalry. What else could you talk about? Changes in society. How did they affect it? Well, I mentioned it in this video. Remember when I was talking about the changes in farming and the inflation and the price rises? Did you remember that? The growth of the towns. It all made it far more difficult to train and practice your archery. Remember the advantages of the musket, far easier to train, nowhere near as long to master the musket, cheaper, mass production. Can you see how you would explain the benefits of the musket and then link that to the decline of the longbow? As ever, I hope it's been useful, ladies and gentlemen. Notice in this video I've talked about factors, science and technology, reasons for change. That will develop more and more as we move into the modern period. So this has been weapons, the nature of war, weapons. The next video, still nature of war, but next time we'll be looking at the composition of the army, size of the army, types of the soldiers used, strategy, tactics, command of the army. All coming in the next video. As ever, I hope it's been useful. All the best now. See you soon. Bye for now.